She was unjustly sentenced to the electric chair, but when she spoke her last words, God saved her. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, their cold glow casting sharp shadows across the narrow cell. Ella sat on the edge of the cot, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the rosary that had been given to her by the prison chaplain. Outside her cell, the muffled sounds of prison life continued. A guard's boots echoing on concrete floors, distant conversations, the faint buzz of static from a radio. But inside, it was silent. Oppressively so. This was the silence of the condemned. Ella's execution was scheduled for midnight. She had no visitors, no appeals left, and no one left to believe in her innocence. The headlines had branded her as a monster, a cold-blooded killer who had kidnapped and murdered Victoria, the beloved daughter of Judge Alexander Langston. She had been dragged through the courts for years, her name spat out on television, radio, and social media. Now, after years of waiting, the state was ready to finish what they had started, but they didn't know the truth. Ella stared at the reflection of her gaunt face in the scratched steel mirror bolted to the wall. Her once vibrant green eyes were now dull, weighed down by years of isolation, grief, and despair. Yet somewhere deep within, a flicker of resolve burned. Tonight, she told herself, everything would change. 3 years earlier, the courtroom had been packed to capacity. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras snapping furiously as Ella was led to the defense table in handcuffs. The prosecution painted her as an unhinged and bitter woman who had developed an unhealthy obsession with Victoria after a brief relationship with Judge Langston. According to their narrative, Ella had kidnapped Victoria out of revenge and killed her when her plans unraveled. Evidence against her had seemed damning. Fingerprints on Victoria's belongings, fabricated witnesses, and damning testimony from Alexander himself. He had sat on the stand, his tailored suit and graying temples giving him the appearance of a grieving father, a man desperate for justice. She was a stalker, Alexander had said, his voice steady but tinged with pain. She couldn't accept that our relationship was over, and Victoria paid the price. Ella's public defender had tried to fight back, to poke holes in the evidence, but Alexander's influence was too great. Witnesses mysteriously changed their stories, records were lost, and the jury, swayed by Alexander's tearful pleas, took less than a day to convict her. Death by lethal injection. Langston's got the warden in his pocket, the chaplain had whispered earlier that evening, his voice trembling as he leaned close to Ella. But if there's any justice left in this world, maybe God will intervene. Justice. The word had lost its meaning to Ella long ago. Her last meal, fried chicken, collard greens and pecan pie, sat untouched on the tray in front of her. She had no appetite. Instead, her mind swirled with memories of the life that had been stolen from her. The night she first met Alexander at a legal fundraiser, his charm disarming and intoxicating, the whirlwind romance that followed, a secret affair hidden from the public eye, and then the betrayal. She hadn't known he was married, not until she discovered she was pregnant. At 11:45 p.m., the guards arrived. One of them, a stocky man with a gruff voice, avoided looking at her as he unlocked the cell door. "It's time," he muttered. Ella stood, her legs trembling as she stepped forward. The rosary slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floor. The chaplain picked it up and pressed it back into her hand, whispering a hurried prayer as the guards cuffed her wrists. The walk to the execution chamber was short, but each step felt like an eternity. Ella could feel the weight of the prison bearing down on her, the cameras mounted on the walls, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the cold gaze of the guards who escorted her. Outside the chamber, the warden stood waiting, flanked by 2 more guards. Behind the glass, the witnesses were already seated, journalists, victims' advocates, and of course, Alexander Langston. He sat in the front row, his face a mask of composed grief. But Ella knew better. She knew the man behind that carefully curated facade, the man who had taken everything from her. As the warden began reading the formal statement of execution, Ella took a deep breath. She could feel the noose of injustice tightening around her neck. But she wasn't going to let it end like this, not without the truth coming to light. "Stop," she said, her voice cracking but firm. The warden hesitated, glancing at her. "I have something to say," Ella continued, her gaze fixed on Alexander. "Victoria isn't dead. She's alive." The chamber erupted into chaos. The warden motioned for the guards to restrain her, but Ella didn't stop. "She's alive," Ella repeated, her voice growing stronger. "And you'll find her in the house of Alexander's parents. Ask them where she is. You'll find everything you need there." Alexander's face, pale and stiff moments ago, contorted into something ugly. His composure cracked. The witnesses stared at him, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Ella's heart pounded as the guards dragged her back, but she saw it, the flicker of fear in Alexander's eyes. For the first time in years, she felt hope. The execution chamber remained in chaos. Ella's revelation hung in the air, her words a knife slicing through the carefully constructed narrative Alexander Langston had built over the years. Guards pulled her from the room, her shackled feet scraping against the cold tile as she yelled, "Check the house! Ask his parents!" Through the glass partition, Alexander's face twisted in panic. For the first time, the invincible judge looked vulnerable, his composure unraveling in front of the assembled witnesses. Back in her holding cell, Ella sat on the cot, her wrists still cuffed. The guards had left her alone, unsure of how to proceed. Outside, the halls buzzed with activity. Within minutes of her outburst, the warden had called for a delay, suspending the execution until the claims could be verified. In the observation room, reporters scrambled to break the story. Headlines flashed across news sites. "Condemned woman claims. Victim is alive. Execution halted." By the time the State Attorney General's office was informed, the clock had struck midnight, and Ella was no longer the state's problem. For now. By dawn, law enforcement officials were at the Langston family estate, a sprawling mansion in upstate New York, surrounded by dense woods and guarded by wrought iron gates. The Langston family's patriarch, Martin Langston, opened the door himself. At 75, his features were sharp, his posture stiff. Behind him stood his wife, Eleanor, her graying hair neatly tied back. Both wore expressions of carefully rehearsed confusion. "We don't know what this is about," Martin said, his voice tinged with indignation. "But you're welcome to look around." The officers entered, sweeping the house methodically. For hours, they combed through rooms, closets, and the basement. At first, they found nothing out of the ordinary, a family's well-kept home filled with antique furniture and heirlooms. But in the guest house behind the main property, they discovered her. Victoria. She was alive. The little girl sat cross-legged on the floor of a sunlit room, clutching a stuffed rabbit. She looked up as the officers entered, her big blue eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and fear. At just 8 years old, she had no idea she was at the center of a storm. When asked her name, she said softly, "Victoria Langston." News of Victoria's discovery broke within hours. Across the nation, shockwaves rippled as people struggled to reconcile the truth with what they had been told. Ella's name, once synonymous with guilt and monstrosity, was suddenly on everyone's lips for a different reason. How could a mother kill her child if the child was still alive? The justice system faced scrutiny, with commentators dissecting the case on every major network. Was this a tragic miscarriage of justice, or had someone manipulated the system to hide their own crimes? For Ella, the revelation brought a glimmer of vindication, but it also deepened her rage. Victoria had been so close all along, hidden in plain sight while she had rotted in prison, and Alexander had known. At the prison, Ella was brought to a small, windowless room for an emergency meeting with the State Attorney General and the lead investigator on her case. 2 guards flanked the door, their hands resting on their belts, while the Attorney General, a sharp-dressed man with a stern face, sat across from her. "Miss Reynolds," he began, "I don't know if you're aware, but Victoria was found alive early this morning." Ella nodded. "I know." The Attorney General leaned forward. "We need to understand how you knew she was there." Ella's gaze was steady as she replied, "Because she's my daughter." A stunned silence filled the room. The lead investigator, a woman in her 40s with keen eyes, spoke next. "What do you mean?" Ella took a deep breath. "Victoria isn't Alexander Langston's daughter. She's mine. He used his power to take her from me and make it look like she was his and his wife's child." The Attorney General exchanged a glance with the investigator. "You're saying Judge Langston falsified records? Fabricated a birth certificate?" Ella nodded. "He destroyed my life to keep his secret. When his wife found out the truth, she wanted to meet with me. That's why she died." As the authorities began to investigate Ella's claims, evidence started to surface. In a dusty storage facility linked to Alexander, police found forged documents that detailed the custody transfer of Victoria from Ella to the Langstons. They also found letters, unsent, but written in the trembling hand of Alexander's late wife, imploring him to tell the truth. The narrative Ella had shared began to piece itself together. A love affair gone wrong, a powerful man desperate to hide his infidelity, and a woman who had lost everything in her quest to reclaim what was hers. Alexander Langston was summoned for questioning, but he arrived flanked by his high-priced legal team, his demeanor cold and composed. "I have nothing to say," he told reporters outside the courthouse. "This is a circus." Inside, his silence told a different story. Pressed by investigators, he fumbled over details, his confidence shaken. The turning point came when Victoria, escorted by child services, identified Ella. "I remember her," she said. "She used to sing to me." Alexander's mask slipped then, his face pale and drawn. He knew the truth was closing in, and there was nowhere left to hide. As the day turned into night, the news cycle was ablaze with updates on the case. Ella, still confined to her cell, sat quietly as the chaplain entered once again. "Victoria is safe," he said softly, "and the world is finally listening." For the first time in years, Ella allowed herself to cry, not tears of sorrow, but of relief. The battle wasn't over, but the tide was turning. The courtroom was quieter this time, though the weight of tension hung heavy in the air. Reporters had been barred, and only essential personnel remained, attorneys, investigators, and the few key witnesses who would decide the next chapter of Ella's fate. On one side of the room sat Ella, clad in her prison-issued jumpsuit but holding her head high. Across from her, Judge Alexander Langston avoided eye contact, his once proud posture beginning to show cracks. The state had agreed to reopen the case following the discovery of Victoria. But this wasn't just about Ella anymore. It was about uncovering the tangled web of lies and manipulations that had allowed Alexander to maintain his iron grip on the narrative for so long. Ella was the first to take the stand. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone, but her voice was steady. "I loved him," she began, her gaze fixed on the attorney leading the questioning. "I was young, naive, and didn't understand the power he had over me. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought it would bring us closer. But Alexander, he had other plans." She described how Alexander initially promised to stand by her, only to disappear for weeks at a time. When she finally confronted him, he dismissed her concerns with smooth reassurances. He told me he'd handle everything, that we'd be a family, she said, her voice cracking. But what he really meant was that he was going to take my daughter from me. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Ella recounted the months leading up to Victoria's birth. I was isolated, she continued. He told me I couldn't tell anyone about the baby. He said it would ruin his career, ruin his family. I believed him because I didn't know I had any other choice. Her voice grew stronger as she described the moment Victoria was born. She was perfect, and for a little while I thought I could keep her. But then Alexander showed up at the hospital with falsified papers. He said it was better this way, that his wife would raise her and Victoria would have a better life than I could give her. The prosecution introduced new evidence, letters written by Alexander's wife, Rebecca, that had been discovered in the storage facility. The letters revealed Rebecca's inner turmoil after discovering the truth about Victoria's parentage. One letter, read aloud in court, brought a collective gasp from the audience. Alexander lied to me. He lied to everyone. I can't live like this anymore, knowing the little girl I've raised as my own was stolen from her real mother. I want to make things right, but I'm afraid of what Alexander might do. The lead prosecutor paused, letting the weight of Rebecca's words sink in. It's clear that Rebecca Langston knew the truth and wanted to reveal it. The question is, why didn't she? Detectives re-examined the car accident that had claimed Rebecca's life. Officially, it had been ruled as a tragic collision caused by icy roads, but new forensic evidence suggested otherwise. Skid marks on the road indicated that Rebecca's brakes had been tampered with. Further investigation revealed that the mechanic who had last serviced her car was linked to one of Alexander's known associates, a man who had received large, unexplained payments around the time of Rebecca's death. Ella listened in stunned silence as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Rebecca had been silenced, her death staged to look like an accident, and it was all to protect Alexander's secrets. Alexander's turn to testify was a spectacle. His once commanding presence had diminished, replaced by a man visibly unraveling under the weight of his lies. His attorneys had advised him to stay calm, but as the prosecutor pressed him on the falsified documents, the bribed witnesses, and the forged custody transfer, his composure began to crack. You have no proof, he snapped at one point, his voice rising. You can't prove any of this. The prosecutor remained unflinching. We don't need to, Judge Langston. Your wife's letters, the falsified records, and the discovery of Victoria, all of it points back to you. You orchestrated everything. When asked directly if he had tampered with Rebecca's car, Alexander refused to answer, invoking his Fifth Amendment rights. But his silence spoke volumes. The most emotional moment of the day came when Victoria was brought into the courtroom. She sat in a small chair next to the judge's bench, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. The prosecutor approached her gently, kneeling to meet her at eye level. Victoria, do you know who this woman is? He asked, pointing to Ella. Victoria looked at Ella for a long moment before nodding. She's my mommy, she said softly. Tears filled Ella's eyes as she struggled to maintain her composure. It was the first time in years she had been allowed to hear her daughter's voice, and the word mommy hit her like a tidal wave. When asked how she knew, Victoria replied, I remember her singing to me when I was little before I lived with Grandpa and Grandma. The courtroom fell silent, the gravity of Victoria's words settling over everyone. For years, Alexander had maintained that Ella was a dangerous woman, unfit to be a mother. But now, even his own daughter contradicted him. The evidence, combined with Ella's testimony and Victoria's recognition, left the defense with little ground to stand on. By the end of the day, the judge presiding over the case ordered Alexander to be taken into custody, pending further investigation. Ella was returned to her cell that evening, but this time she wasn't alone. The lead prosecutor visited her with news. "You'll be released tomorrow," he said, a small smile breaking through his otherwise professional demeanor. "The state is dropping all charges." Ella felt the weight of the words sink in. After years of being branded a monster, the truth had finally prevailed. That night, Ella lay awake in her cell, staring at the ceiling. She was free, but her fight wasn't over. Victoria was still a stranger to her in many ways, and the scars of what Alexander had done would take years to heal. But for the first time in years, Ella allowed herself to hope. The news of Alexander Langston's arrest dominated headlines across the nation. Once lauded as a pillar of justice, he now faced multiple charges: falsification of legal documents, conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with evidence, and more. His name, once synonymous with integrity, was now a symbol of corruption. The unraveling of his empire was swift and merciless, but for Ella, it was bittersweet. Justice was finally being served, but the damage to her life and her daughter's was immeasurable. Alexander's fall sent shockwaves through his social and professional circles. Prominent attorneys, judges, and politicians who had once aligned themselves with him distanced themselves quickly, their statements dripping with feigned shock and regret. The media coverage grew relentless. News anchors dissected his every decision, from his courtroom rulings to his political affiliations. Alexander's family estate became a circus, with reporters camped outside day and night. For Martin and Eleanor Langston, his parents, the shame was palpable. Though they had cared for Victoria, they could no longer deny their son's monstrous actions. 2 days after her release, Ella stood outside a modest government building, her heart pounding. She had been told Victoria would meet her there, escorted by a child services worker. The thought of seeing her daughter, of holding her for the first time in years, filled Ella with both joy and apprehension. When the doors opened, Ella froze. Victoria stepped out, clutching her stuffed rabbit as always, her wide blue eyes scanning the crowd. When their eyes met, the little girl hesitated, as if trying to reconcile the image of the mother she barely remembered with the woman standing before her. "Mommy?" Victoria's voice was soft, uncertain. Ella dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, baby, it's me, I'm here." Victoria ran into her arms, burying her face in Ella's shoulder. The two clung to each other, neither willing to let go. For Ella, it was a moment she had dreamed of every day during her imprisonment. For Victoria, it was the beginning of understanding the truth about her past. As Alexander's trial loomed, prosecutors worked tirelessly to build an airtight case. The evidence was overwhelming. Forged custody papers, financial records showing bribes paid to key witnesses, and even testimony from the mechanic who had tampered with Rebecca's brakes under Alexander's orders. In court, Alexander remained defiant, his lawyers arguing that he had acted in the best interests of his family. "I did what I had to do to protect my daughter," he declared, his voice steady but his eyes betraying desperation. The prosecution, however, dismantled his defense piece by piece. Witnesses came forward, emboldened by his arrest, to share stories of intimidation and coercion. A former clerk at the courthouse testified about being ordered to misplace evidence during Ella's original trial. A close friend of Rebecca's revealed that Rebecca had confided in her about Alexander's threats shortly before her death. The most damning testimony, however, came from Martin and Eleanor Langston. In a shocking move, the couple took the stand against their own son. Martin, his voice heavy with guilt, admitted that he and his wife had agreed to care for Victoria under Alexander's instructions, believing it was for the child's safety. "We didn't know the full extent of his lies," Martin said, "but we know now that we were complicit, and for that, we're deeply sorry." In a heartbreaking moment, Victoria herself was brought to testify. With her stuffed rabbit on her lap, she spoke in a small, trembling voice about her life with the Langstons. "Grandma and Grandpa were nice," she said, "but I always felt like something was missing." When asked if she remembered anything about her mother, Victoria hesitated before answering. "She used to sing to me. I remember her voice." Her words, though simple, carried a powerful truth. They were a reminder that no matter how far Alexander had gone to erase Ella, he could never fully sever the bond between mother and daughter. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all counts. Alexander Langston was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The announcement was met with cheers outside the courthouse, but inside, the atmosphere was somber. As Alexander was led away in handcuffs, he turned to glare at Ella one last time. "You think you've won," he hissed. "This isn't over." Ella met his gaze, her voice calm and steady. "Yes, it is." With Alexander behind bars, Ella began the difficult task of rebuilding her life. Victoria, now officially back in her custody, struggled to adjust to her new reality. The transition wasn't easy. Victoria had spent years thinking of the Langstons as her family, and Ella was practically a stranger. But Ella refused to give up. She enrolled Victoria in therapy, determined to help her daughter heal from the trauma of her early years. Slowly but surely, they began to forge a new bond, one built on love and trust. Surprisingly, Ella found herself reaching out to Martin and Eleanor Langston. Despite their role in keeping Victoria from her, Ella couldn't ignore the fact that they had loved and cared for her daughter. She arranged a meeting, bringing Victoria along. The reunion was tense at first, but as Victoria hugged her grandparents tightly, the tension melted away. Ella watched as Martin, once so cold and distant, broke down in tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything." "I know," Ella replied, "but it's time to move forward, for Victoria's sake." One evening, after tucking Victoria into bed, Ella sat on the porch of their small new home, staring at the stars. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be long, but she was no longer walking it alone. The sun cast a warm, golden hue over the quiet suburban street as Ella watched Victoria run across their small yard, her laughter echoing in the crisp morning air. It had been 6 months since Alexander Langston's conviction, and Ella was finally beginning to feel the weight of the past lifting. The house they now lived in wasn't extravagant, a modest, 2-bedroom home on the edge of a sleepy town, but it was theirs. And for Ella, it symbolized something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. Life with Victoria had been both a blessing and a challenge. The little girl was curious, asking questions about her past that were sometimes hard to answer. "Why did I have to stay with Grandma and Grandpa for so long?" she'd asked one evening, her voice innocent but her gaze serious. Ella knelt beside her, holding her small hands. "Because someone made bad choices, sweetheart. Choices that hurt both of us. But I promise, you're safe now, and we'll always be together." Victoria nodded, seeming to accept the answer, but Ella knew there would be more questions in time. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. Victoria's years with the Langstons had shaped her in ways Ella was still discovering, but Ella remained patient, knowing that healing would take time. One of the most surprising developments in their new life was the growing relationship between Ella and the Langston family elders, Martin and Eleanor. After their first meeting, they began visiting regularly, often bringing small gifts for Victoria. A favorite snack, a new book, or a game. At first, Ella had been cautious, unsure of their motives, but as the weeks passed, she saw the genuine affection they held for Victoria and their quiet remorse for their role in Alexander's crimes. Martin, once so stern and unyielding, now spoke with humility, often taking quiet walks with Ella in the yard, discussing the past. "We failed you," he admitted one afternoon, his voice heavy with regret. "We should have questioned him. But he was our son, and we were blind." Ella placed a hand on his shoulder. "What's done is done. The only thing that matters now is Victoria's future." Ella also faced the challenge of rebuilding her own life. Her name, once dragged through the mud, was now being discussed in a different light. True crime podcasts, documentaries, and news specials detailed her story, and for the first time, the world saw her as a victim, not a villain. One evening, a local journalist approached Ella about sharing her story. "You've been through so much," the woman said gently. "People need to hear it, from you, in your own words." At first, Ella hesitated. She didn't want to relive the nightmare she had endured. But as she thought about the countless others who might be suffering in silence, she realized she had a chance to be a voice for them. The article published weeks later was raw and honest, detailing not just her pain, but her resilience. It was met with widespread support, and letters poured in from people who had been inspired by her strength. Victoria's integration into her new school wasn't without its hiccups. Some children teased her when they learned about the media coverage surrounding her family, and she often came home quiet, clutching her rabbit for comfort. Ella noticed the subtle changes in her demeanor and decided to act. She enrolled Victoria in art therapy, a place where the little girl could express herself freely. Slowly, Victoria began to open up, drawing pictures of their new life together, flowers in the yard, their small home, and the two of them holding hands. The sessions brought a sense of calm to both of them, and Ella often joined in, painting her own visions of the future. Ella's decision to forgive Martin and Eleanor wasn't easy, but it felt right. She invited them to join her and Victoria for Thanksgiving that year, a small but meaningful gesture. The meal was humble: turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie, but the atmosphere was warm. As they sat around the table, Victoria grinned. "This is the best Thanksgiving ever," she declared, her cheeks stuffed with pie. Ella smiled, tears prickling her eyes. "It's the first of many," she promised. At the end of the evening, Eleanor approached Ella. "You've shown us kindness we don't deserve," she said quietly, "but I hope you know we'll do everything we can to make things right." "You already are," Ella replied, embracing her. Months turned into a year, and the scars of the past began to fade. Ella found a job at a local community center where she worked with at-risk youth, using her experience to guide and support them. She also began writing, filling journals with thoughts and memories, and someday hoped to turn them into a book. Victoria continued to thrive, her confidence growing with each passing day. She no longer clung to her stuffed rabbit as a shield, but carried it as a reminder of her journey. Together, they planted a garden in their yard, filling it with bright flowers and fruit trees. It became a symbol of their new life, something beautiful growing out of the darkness. One spring morning, Ella and Victoria stood in the yard, planting a young oak tree. It was Victoria's idea, inspired by a story she'd heard in school about trees symbolizing growth and resilience. "Do you think it'll get really big?" Victoria asked, patting the soil around the roots. "I know it will," Ella said, smiling, "just like us." As they stepped back to admire their work, the sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled light across their faces. Ella wrapped her arm around Victoria, pulling her close. "We've been through so much," Ella whispered, "but we're here now, and nothing will ever take us away from each other again." Victoria looked up at her, her eyes shining with trust and love. "I love you, Mommy. I love you too, sweetheart, always." As the tree stood tall against the sky, its roots sinking deep into the earth, Ella and Victoria began the next chapter of their lives, a story no longer defined by pain, but by hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.